Everyone knows the names Isaac and Ishmael. Two sons, two mothers, a family divided, a story retold for thousands of years across three major world religions. But Genesis records a third mother and a fourth son, and Genesis itself barely pauses to mention him at all. After Sarah's death, the book of Genesis tells us, Abraham took another wife, a woman named Keturah, and fathered 6 more sons. One brief genealogical list, a handful of unfamiliar names, and then the text moves on entirely, never returning to most of these children again. Except one of them does return. Not in Genesis, not for centuries. His name resurfaces later, in a completely different book, in a completely different story, attached to a nation that will go on to shape the life of Moses himself, clash violently with Israel in the wilderness, and eventually be defeated by a reluctant judge named Gideon. His name was Midian, and the mystery of Abraham's forgotten son is not simply that Genesis forgets him, it's that the rest of the Bible very clearly does not. Tonight we're going to trace something the vast majority of readers never notice, a single figure, given only a few words in Genesis, whose descendants reappear again and again across the biblical narrative, playing roles far larger than his brief introduction would ever suggest. We'll look honestly at what Genesis actually says about Midian and his brothers, what archaeology has uncovered about a real ancient people called the Midianites, and how this forgotten branch of Abraham's family becomes entangled with Moses, with Israel's wilderness wanderings, and with one of the most dramatic military campaigns recorded in the entire Hebrew Bible. By the end, you'll understand why a son mentioned in a single genealogical verse became one of the most historically and narratively significant figures connected to Abraham's entire family line, considerably more significant in terms of later biblical consequence than his brief introduction would ever lead a casual reader to expect. It's worth naming directly why this particular mystery rewards careful attention rather than a quick answer. Most readers encounter Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Judges as separate books, often studied or referenced independently of one another. Tracing a single genealogical thread like Midian's across all 4 requires reading the Hebrew Bible the way its earliest audiences likely experienced it, not as isolated episodes, but as one continuous, unfolding story in which a name mentioned briefly in one book can resurface, transformed by circumstance, hundreds of years later in another. To understand why Midian matters, we first need to understand exactly where Genesis places him and why that geography turns out to carry real historical weight. Genesis chapter 25 tells us that after fathering these 6 sons with Keturah, Abraham sent them away eastward, to the land of the east, while giving his primary inheritance to Isaac alone. This detail matters enormously for understanding the text's own internal logic. Unlike Ishmael, whose story receives real narrative attention earlier in Genesis, including a direct divine promise concerning his own future nation, the sons of Keturah are dispatched briefly and then narratively set aside, sent toward the regions east and southeast of Canaan, generally understood to correspond to areas of the Arabian Peninsula and the region east of the Jordan and the Gulf of Aqaba. This eastward, Arabian-adjacent geography is significant because it is precisely where later biblical texts, and independently modern archaeology, locate the historical Midianites. The region most closely associated with ancient Midian spans portions of northwestern Arabia and areas east of the Gulf of Aqaba, a geography consistent across multiple later biblical references describing Midianite territory and Midianite trading activity. It's worth noting that the ancient world Genesis describes here was one crisscrossed by trade routes connecting Arabia, the Levant, and Egypt. Routes along which pastoral and trading peoples, like those associated with Midian's later descendants, are historically well attested. This is not an obscure, invented location. It is a real, historically active corridor of the ancient Near East, and placing Abraham's sixth son's descendants there connects Genesis's brief notice to a genuinely documented later people and place. This trading context becomes directly relevant to how Midianites appear elsewhere in Scripture as well. In Genesis chapter 37, a group of Midianite traders, traveling with camels carrying spices and merchandise, purchase Joseph from his brothers and carry him onward into Egypt, a detail placing Midianite commercial activity along exactly the kind of trans-regional trade corridor connecting Canaan to Egypt that archaeology independently confirms was active during this general period. This brief appearance, occurring well before Moses' own later connection to Midian, offers an early narrative confirmation, entirely consistent with Genesis's own geography, that Midianite communities were already understood, within the text's own internal world, as established, mobile, and economically active well before the events of Exodus. Let's look directly at what Genesis actually says, because the sparseness itself is worth sitting with. Genesis 25, verses 1 through 4, records that Abraham took a wife named Keturah, who bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. It further names several of Midian's own sons, Ephah, Epher, Hanoch, Abida, and Eldaah, before the text states plainly that Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, while giving gifts to the sons of his concubines and sending them away from Isaac, eastward, while he was still living. That is essentially the entirety of Midian's direct appearance within the book of Genesis itself. No narrative episode, no dialogue, no description of his character, his choices, or his life. Simply a name within a list, followed immediately by his dispatch away from the central inheritance narrative Genesis is primarily interested in telling. This kind of brief genealogical notice, followed by narrative silence, is not unusual in Genesis's broader structure. The book regularly uses genealogies to acknowledge figures and peoples related to Israel's own story, without dwelling on them individually, reserving detailed narrative attention primarily for the specific covenant line running through Isaac and Jacob. But Midian's case stands out precisely because of what happens later, considerably later, when this same name resurfaces in a context Genesis itself gives no hint of anticipating. It's worth comparing Midian's treatment directly to Ishmael's within this same broader genealogical pattern, since the contrast is instructive. Ishmael, though also set outside the primary covenant line running through Isaac, still receives a specific divine promise earlier in Genesis concerning the size and significance of the nation he would father, along with a named, described departure narrative involving Hagar in the wilderness. Midian and his brothers receive no comparable promise, no narrative episode of their own, and no direct divine attention within Genesis at all. Simply a name, a place in a list, and a brief note about being sent eastward with gifts. This makes the sheer scale of Midian's later biblical significance considerably more striking by comparison, since it develops entirely without the kind of narrative foreshadowing Genesis provides for Ishmael's own later prominence. The next time Midian appears meaningfully in Scripture, we are no longer in Genesis at all. We are in the book of Exodus, generations later, and the man at the center of the story is not Abraham's son directly, but a fugitive from Egypt, Moses. Having fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian overseer, Moses arrives in the land of Midian, where he assists the daughters of a local priest at a well, and is subsequently welcomed into that priest's household, eventually marrying one of his daughters, Zipporah. This priest is named, across different passages, both Jethro and Reuel, a variation scholars generally attribute to differing source traditions preserved within the text, rather than to two entirely separate individuals. This is a genuinely remarkable narrative turn, worth pausing on directly. The man who will lead Israel out of slavery, receive the law at Sinai, and become the central figure of the entire Exodus narrative, spends a formative period of his life, specifically among the descendants of Abraham's largely overlooked sixth son, marries into a Midianite family, and receives guidance, later in the narrative, directly from his Midianite father-in-law, who advises Moses on organizing Israel's judicial system during the wilderness wandering, and vice Moses on Genesis gave Midian no story. Exodus, without ever directly referencing Genesis's brief genealogical notice, quietly assumes an entire nation descended from him, established, settled, and organized enough to include a functioning priesthood and meaningful political structure, generations after Abraham's own lifetime. The forgotten son, in other words, had descendants substantial enough to shape the household and worldview of history's most consequential biblical lawgiver. Jethro's specific role as priest deserves closer attention, because the text treats his religious authority with real seriousness rather than incidental detail. When Moses first returns to Egypt after his encounter with God at the burning bush, it is Jethro he approaches for permission to leave, suggesting a household structure in which Moses, though clearly the central figure of the unfolding Exodus narrative, still operated within Jethro's household authority during this formative period. Later, in Exodus chapter 18, Jethro travels to meet Moses in the wilderness, brings Moses' wife and sons to him, and upon witnessing Moses judging disputes among the Israelites single-handedly from morning to evening, offers direct, practical administrative counsel, appoint capable men over groups of varying size to share the burden of judgment. Moses, notably, follows this advice precisely as given, establishing a structure the text describes in detail, a genuinely significant organizational contribution to Israel's early governance, offered by, and credited directly to, a Midianite priest. The relationship between Israel and Midian does not remain purely positive for long, and this shift itself is historically and narratively significant. By the Book of Numbers, Midianite communities appear in a considerably more adversarial role, associated closely with Moabite influence in a narrative involving Israelite men being drawn into idolatrous worship and immoral conduct at a place called Peor, provoking, according to the text, a serious and costly divine judgment against Israel. The text specifically names a Midianite woman involved in this episode, and the resulting conflict leads to a sustained military campaign against Midian, described later in the same book, one Moses himself commissions before his own death. This dramatic reversal, from Moses' own in-laws providing crucial early support and guidance to open military conflict a generation later, reflects something historically plausible about how relationships between related tribal confederations in the ancient Near East could genuinely shift over time, shaped by changing political alliances, competing territorial and economic interests, and religious tension, rather than remaining static across generations. It's worth being honest that the biblical text itself does not explain this shift in detail. It simply presents both phases of the relationship without extensive commentary connecting them, leaving readers across many centuries to notice and wrestle with the tension themselves. The Peor episode itself, recorded in Numbers chapter 25, describes Israelite men engaging in both sexual and religious unfaithfulness with Moabite and Midianite women, drawn specifically into the worship of a local deity called Baal of Peor, provoking what the text describes as a severe plague among the Israelite camp. A specific incident involving an Israelite man and a Midianite woman named Cosbi, daughter of a Midianite tribal leader, becomes the immediate flashpoint prompting decisive action, described in the text as bringing the plague to an end. The scale of the resulting judgment against Midian, commissioned by Moses shortly before his own death and carried out under the priest Eleazar and a force of 12,000 men drawn from Israel's tribes, reflects just how seriously this particular breach of covenant faithfulness was treated within the text's own narrative logic, marking a definitive and violent close to the earlier, more cooperative relationship established through Jethro's household generations before. But Midian's most dramatic later reappearance in Scripture still lay ahead, in a story many casual readers know well, without ever connecting it back to this same, largely forgotten branch of Abraham's family. Generations after Moses, in the period of the Judges, Midianite raiders become one of the most significant threats Israel faces, described in the book of Judges as sweeping into Israelite territory alongside allied peoples, devastating crops and livestock so thoroughly that Israelites are described hiding in mountain dens and caves simply to survive. It is against this specific threat that Gideon, initially introduced hiding while threshing wheat in a winepress to avoid Midianite detection, is called by God to lead Israel's resistance. The resulting narrative, including Gideon's famous reduction of his own army to a mere 300 men before the decisive battle, represents one of the most detailed, sustained military narratives found anywhere in the book of Judges, and it is fought from beginning to end, specifically against the descendants of Abraham's sixth son. Read alongside Genesis's original brief notice. This represents an extraordinary narrative arc, even though the biblical text itself never explicitly draws the connection across these widely separated books. A son sent quietly eastward with gifts, out of the central inheritance narrative, becomes, across many centuries and multiple biblical books, first the family into which Israel's greatest lawgiver marries, then a source of serious religious and military conflict, and finally, the enemy at the center of one of the most memorable military deliverance stories in the entire Hebrew Bible. Few genealogical footnotes in all of Scripture cast a longer narrative shadow across the rest of the biblical text. The details of Gideon's campaign itself are worth recounting briefly, because they underscore just how significant this final confrontation with Midian was understood to be within Israel's own historical memory. After reducing his initial force of 32,000 men down to 300 through a series of deliberate tests described in careful narrative detail, Gideon's small band routs the vastly larger Midianite camp, using torches hidden inside clay jars, trumpets, and a coordinated nighttime surprise, causing panic and confusion within the Midianite ranks. The subsequent pursuit and defeat of the Midianite kings, described across the remainder of the chapter, is remembered elsewhere in Scripture as a defining example of unlikely deliverance, referenced by later prophetic writers as a byword for God's ability to save through seemingly inadequate means. It's worth asking, honestly, what independent historical and archaeological evidence exists for a genuine ancient people called the Midianites, beyond the biblical text's own account. Archaeological work across northwestern Arabia and the regions east of the Gulf of Aqaba has identified a distinctive material culture, particularly a recognizable style of painted pottery scholars often call kuraya ware, associated with settlements and copper mining activity in this general region during roughly the second half of the second millennium before Christ, a period many scholars associate with the approximate era the biblical narrative places Moses and the early Israelite wilderness period. Sites including areas around Timnah, an ancient copper mining region, have produced materials some archaeologists connect specifically to Midianite activity, including evidence of a distinctive portable shrine structure some researchers have proposed relates to the kind of tabernacle worship described in the biblical text itself. It's important, as always in this series, to state the limits of this evidence honestly. Scholars continue to actively debate the precise identification, extent, and chronology of this material culture, and connecting specific archaeological finds definitively to the biblical Midianites rather than to a related or neighboring ancient population remains a genuinely contested question within the field rather than a settled consensus. What we can say responsibly is that the general geographic region, the approximate historical period, and the kind of pastoral, trading, metalworking culture this archaeological evidence reveals are all broadly consistent with the biblical text's own portrait of Midian, even where individual details remain the subject of ongoing scholarly investigation rather than final proof. The Timnah excavations specifically, led over several decades by archaeologists including Benno Rothenberg and later teams continuing his work, uncovered extensive evidence of ancient copper mining and smelting activity, along with a small tent shrine structure dated to a period some researchers associate with a Midianite or Midianite-influenced presence at the site, distinguished by painted pottery fragments matching the broader kuraya ware tradition. This shrine structure, involving a portable, tent-based sacred space rather than permanent temple architecture, has drawn scholarly comparison to the biblical tabernacle's own design, though responsible scholars are careful to note this as an interesting structural parallel worth considering, rather than direct proof of any specific connection between the two. Such findings illustrate the genuine, ongoing nature of archaeological work in this region, continuing to add incremental evidence to a picture that remains, honestly, still developing rather than fully settled. We began tonight with a single overlooked verse. Naming a son, Genesis introduces and then almost immediately sends away, out of its own central narrative attention. We end with something considerably larger than a forgotten genealogical footnote, a family line that reappears across centuries and multiple biblical books, shaping the household of Moses, testing Israel's faithfulness in the wilderness, and finally standing as the adversary at the center of one of the Hebrew Bible's most memorable stories of deliverance. Genesis chose to tell Isaac's story in careful, sustained detail, and Midian's in a single sentence. But Scripture as a whole, read across its full span rather than one book at a time, did not forget him nearly as thoroughly as that first brief mention might suggest. Perhaps that is the real lesson tucked inside this particular mystery, that a story Scripture tells briefly is not always a story Scripture considers unimportant, and that some of the Bible's most consequential threads begin not with a dramatic introduction, but with a name, quietly sent eastward, waiting generations to matter again. 6 sons sent east with gifts and little else, 5 centuries, by the traditional reckoning most scholars associate with the span between Abraham and Gideon, separating a single genealogical verse from a battlefield outside a Midianite camp. A father-in-law's counsel, a plague at Peor, 300 men with torches and trumpets in the night. Genesis never tells us it was building toward any of this. It simply lets a name go quiet and trusts the rest of Scripture, read patiently and in full, to explain exactly how loud that quiet name would eventually become.